Good morning. How are you?
Very good. Good morning. Thank you so much I know how busy you are. I
Yeah.
can't imagine when you were appointed Surgeon General I knew you'd be focused on trauma and healthcare and all your work prior to your appointment, but that you'd be dealing with it during a pandemic, um,
Yeah.
specifically after. I can't imagine.
I don't think any of us imagined this, but this is what we prepare for, right? This is what we train for. And so I have a sense of it's definitely busy, it's definitely intense, but I will have to say that I feel a sense of gratitude of being able to be here in this moment and be able to share the information and provide the supports and be there for so many families who are in need right now. So um, I'm considering it a privilege to serve right now.
I understand. And having followed your work, which you know that I do, how did you can I just
Hmm.
jump right in and
Yeah.
ask, how did you come to your work? I know you're a pediatrician, but how did you come to your work and your focus on trauma and trauma care?
Well, it's really interesting. I have always had a strong interest in serving vulnerable communities. And when I finished my residency training at Stanford, I wanted to be someplace where I could put my talents and training to use. And so I opened a clinic in one of San Francisco's most underserved neighborhoods. And a very interesting thing happened. I was seeing patients over and over and over again with disproportionate levels of asthma and weird autoimmune diseases, and certainly lots of mental health and behavioral challenges. And as a scientist and a researcher, if I were seeing, exorbitant numbers of kids with autism, right, I would do the research and learn about autism. But what I was seeing was that uh, the pattern I was observing was that common to my most severe cases, whether it was asthma or attention deficit, the vast majority of the kids that I was caring for had some significant trauma. And whether it was they had a parent who was struggling with mental illness or substance dependence, or they were witnessing domestic violence at home, I was observing that it was affecting their health. And so I really dove into the science about how early adversity affects the developing brains and bodies of kids. And I will tell you, what I learned blew my mind because, I did my pediatrics residency training at Stanford. And I never learned in medical school or residency about the effect of adverse childhood experiences on brain development, right? That it actually affects the development of children's brains, but not only their brains, their immune system, their hormonal systems, even the way their DNA is read and transcribed. And I really felt like this is something that not only every pediatrician should know about, but every person should know about, right? Like every parent, every educator, like everyone in the world needs to know that early adversity gets under our skin and changes our biology.
So many people don't take trauma seriously. They hear trauma and they think it's something you can choose to overcome. You can open yourself up. You can relax into it. You can be forgiving of something that happened. But they don't understand how it's really affected you, so they don't treat it, and we don't have strong treatment for trauma
That's
care.
right.
Um,
There are a lot of people who think that trauma is hurt feelings, right? And that if you pull yourself up by your bootstraps, you can just choose to get over it, right? And what I think that doesn't recognize is that when we're exposed to uh, high levels of trauma and adversity, and especially during the critical years of childhood when our brains and bodies are developing, that releases stress hormones like adrenaline and cortisol. And that has biological impacts on our bodies. So a child who has experienced 4 or more adverse childhood experiences, and that includes, you know, being victim to abuse or neglect, or growing up in a household where there's parental substance dependence, incarceration, domestic violence, where there's parental separation or divorce or parental mental illness. And a child who's experienced 4 or more of those adverse childhood experiences, they're twice as likely to develop asthma. They're up to 32 times as likely to have learning and behavior problems. And when they grow up, they're twice as likely to have to develop heart disease, stroke, cancer, chronic lung disease. These are not small impacts, and we're just now beginning to understand how exposure to high levels of trauma and adversity are affecting the way our brains and bodies function and increasing our risk for serious health complications.
I'm so happy you're in the position you're in. And I know within even this state, there's so much to do, because our system here, long before the virus and the pandemic, is a very imperfect system with many, with I believe at its core, missing this particular understanding, the understanding of when something happens, or when especially a child has gone through multiple things, what do they need, how to address them, how serious is it, what is it that you're looking at, then how to take the steps to give them the care. So I imagine you're looking at many of those steps.
So that's right. So when Governor Newsom appointed me to be the first Surgeon General of the state of California, part of the reason was because he has read the research and understands the significant impact that trauma has on health and development. And what we're doing here in California is a first in the nation effort. We're the first state in the country to, number one, we are doing broad scale training, and for the first time, reimbursement, right, for primary care doctors. So, pediatricians and OBGYNs and internists, actually, to ask these questions. We're the first state in the nation to do routine screening for trauma in an initiative that's called ACEs Aware. It's something that I've been really excited to lead. And so that's been my focus coming in as our first Surgeon General. And then you can imagine, with this COVID-19 pandemic, right? Mm-hmm. The measures that we have to take, the necessary measures, right? Because this is really serious, but the measures that we have to take in terms of physical distancing, sheltering in place, is great if your home is safe. But there are a lot of people across our state, our country, and our world for whom home is not safe, right? And what we've seen in the past several weeks is that our reports of child maltreatment have dropped by 40 to 50%, right? Which is,
what does that tell you? And maybe for people that don't understand the reporting or the fear of being in the house, what does that mean when it drops?
Yeah, what that means is that the people who usually are the nurturing, caring adults in a child's life, who might notice that something is going on and inquire and check in and say, how are you? And actually learn that a child is at home with a parent who's struggling with substance dependence and maybe, did something to harm the child. They're no longer coming into contact with any of those folks, not with a rabbi or the pastor, not with a coach, not with an art instructor. And so what we see is that it's not that we think that child maltreatment is going down. In fact, it's likely going up, but what we see is that it's going undetected.
And that's a big concern with the schools. I think people don't realize, and it was something I wanted to ask you. I know with all of this, knowing how trauma affects children, everyone, but focusing, it's my dogs. There's the doing meetings at home. Um, knowing how trauma, the effect it has on the body, knowing how many families are in a situation that abuse, not just a normal family, is under a situation with extreme trauma. They're in one room losing their job and on the phone and crying or screaming about something, or arguing with each other because of the stress, being short with their children, even the most loving parents. And then, of course, the extreme cases where the abuse has always been there and now there's no one to watch. Different levels, but what can we do to help ourselves? Maybe is one question, the person who's in the situation. And then also, what can we do to watch for helping others? Like maybe a teacher who might be on Skype, or a friend or neighbor who maybe could identify or check in.
I'm so glad you asked that question. So this is the thing that I've dedicated my career to, is the piece about this work that for me I actually find most important and most hopeful, is that there is a lot of evidence about the things that can actually make a difference and improve health and well-being for folks who have experienced trauma, right? And what all of the research shows is that the single most powerful antidote to the impacts of trauma and adversity is nurturing, caring relationships with others, right? Safe, stable, and nurturing relationships. And so what that means is that right now, even though we have to be physically distant, it's actually more important than ever for us to stay emotionally connected. And that can be, for example, educators, or anyone in a child's life, or frankly even in an adult's life, right? To reach out and check in, especially if you're concerned or worried that someone may be vulnerable, right? To reach out and check in, text, call, FaceTime, whatever it is. That emotional connection actually is truly deeply healing. The other piece about it, and I think especially for parents, one of the things that's really important is that our own emotional well-being is really, really important for our kids' emotional well-being. And so when we are, I think especially for, a lot of parents right now are trying to work from home while they now have a second job as a homeschool teacher. I know you have 6 kids. I want to know how you're doing with that. But it's really challenging, and it's really easy for folks to get frustrated, for tempers to flare. And it's really important for us right now to just give ourselves a break, adjust our expectations, and recognize that because this is a stressful time, that it's not just in our minds, that our bodies are actually making more stress hormones. And that means that we can do the things to reduce the amount of stress hormones that our bodies make. Things like regular exercise, getting 30 to 60 minutes of exercise a day, even if it's just an indoor dance party, right? Like if it's that yoga in front of the screen, whatever it is. Sleep makes a really big difference. I think a lot of us, because we're not leaving the house, we're like, okay, we can stay up until midnight and the kids have a different bedtime. And it's like, it's just as important to keep our regular routines, because our bodies actually yeah, well, our bodies actually have a rhythm, right? And then when we get out of that rhythm, it's actually biologically stressful. So it's good to keep those regular sleep times, wake up times, meal times, doing things like mindfulness, like meditation. Also, it's an interesting thing about mindfulness, because when you activate your stress response, that's something called the sympathetic nervous system. And what we do with mindfulness, and especially with breathing, is that actually turns up our parasympathetic, the nervous system that fights your fight or flight response. So you have your fight or flight, and then there's resting and digesting. And when we do mindfulness and meditation, it actually strengthens our parasympathetic nervous system so that it can counter an overactive stress response. So all of these things, good nutrition, all of these pieces are really important to help us biologically regulate our stress.
And then for those, and I'm going to try to do as many of those as possible, but I'm sure I'm terrible with them. I feel like as you're talking, I'm thinking, God, I wish she was my pediatrician when I was little. I needed a lot of this guidance. For those who can, so that is, as I've heard you, and I think it's so important that people hear that, to love each other, check in with each other, be there, be a support group, keep your eyes open, whether you're a teacher, a friend, whatever it is. We have something that's very known, unfortunately, about domestic violence is that a lot of people don't believe the victim. They don't support the victim when it's happening, and as they go through whatever it is, no matter what evidence comes up, it's just something very difficult for them to understand. Like even the trauma that was experienced by the victims is very difficult for them to absorb and understand. I think what you're saying is you have to. It's very important, if you love these people, to understand what they've been through and help them. So I do hope people hear this and they do reach out and they do pay more attention, and they're not sitting in a moment where they think, well, maybe, but it's not my business. And they really, because those kids aren't going to school right now, and so teachers can't see the bruises, and people aren't identifying what's happening within some homes.
Can I interrupt you to ask you a question? So I think, to your point, right, one of the big challenges is that people feel uncomfortable, people look away, people don't want to get involved. And I will say that for me, the people always ask me what's the hardest part of my job. And the way I answer that question, the hardest part of my job is being witness long enough so that I can actually be effective in doing something, right? Because when you sit there as a witness, it's hard. You want to turn away. It's a self-protective mechanism. And what I want to ask you is, you have done work on behalf of vulnerable women and children around the world. I actually have two questions. Number one, like what motivates you to continue to stand as a witness, right? And to not look away? What motivates you to do that? And two, what do you do for self-care, right? Because in order to be able to do that and be a witness, you actually have to practice some pretty good self-care so that you can replenish, right? And that you're not depleted or defeated by that.
It's a very nice question. I think I like you, was very, in my own way, I felt very, there was a time in my life where I became more aware of what was happening around the world, and what happens in our own country, and what happens in people's lives. And, I opened up, and I hope that I could be useful. And I really can't think what else life is about other than somehow finding a way of being useful. But you're right. In the beginning, I wrote a journal. I used to write just because I would cry all the time. And so I was writing, people wouldn't see that I was crying. And then I remembered it was this wonderful grandmother who was taking care of all these kids. She lost all her siblings. And she saw me crying. And I thought I was being very emotional and very connected. And she just said, I don't need you to cry. I need you to help me. And I, so I thought, all right, I may have these feelings and about things that I may be witness to, but that doesn't help. Those feelings those feelings put into action, those feelings somehow, and very fortunate that I'm able to do some work, speak to you, do something that moves something forward. So
yeah.
helps.
That's
But
right. Because
I'm just a little stress ball. I don't really. I'm not.
because I think, but I actually think that that is the thing when you're talking about friends and families and what friends and family can do and how important it is. I think part of the reason that folks sometimes want to be a little hands off because they don't know what to do. They're worried about doing the wrong thing, right? And they're worried about kind of letting it letting it in. It's hard, and I think your point is exactly right. All you have to do is be there for a person. All you have to do is believe it when believe them when a victim comes forward, right? That is what you can do. And what's powerful about it is that the science shows us that nurturing relationship, that connection, that someone saying, I believe you and I'm so sorry that this happened to you, right? You don't have to fix it. You don't have to solve it, but you can be there. And if you can, even just to talk to someone every day, or if you have a couch that someone can sleep on, or whatever it is, whatever resource or connection that you can provide, you don't have to worry about not being enough. You just have to um, be willing to be there and listen and to be, that shoulder and those open arms.
And I think, if I can say, I think part of the why the work on trauma that you're doing is so important, and then people understanding it, because a lot of people, for example, don't they think that for a parent yelling at another parent or being threatening or yelling is not abuse, because it's not their idea of what abuse is. And so I think, and so therefore their idea that maybe that behavior in front of a child isn't causing any trauma, because their idea of what is traumatic. So to unwrap all of that for people to really understand what their behavior, what their words do, what actions that may not be so obvious, certain control abuse, emotional abuse, financial abuse, all of these things that people go through. So I'm, uh, you know, for another time to go even deeper into that. But for this time, how can somebody who you have this great I've heard you when you your wonderful TED talk, which I would encourage, but you speak about the bear and the bear being in the house, right? And that for those people who are stuck at home, I notice that people are texting more their problems, which says a lot if people think about it, because if you're calling, you're able to call and say, I need help. If you're texting, you're not alone in the room. And so every time I read that the texts have gone up, I just imagine all those people frightened in a room. Who can they text? What can they do? How do they reach out? Knowing that this is a very imperfect system and has a lot, they can't just throw themselves into this system, but there are helplines and places to go.
Yes, that's right. So the 24-hour National Domestic Violence Hotline has a text line. So anyone can text love is, LOVEIS, to 22522, which is the 24/7 text line. And it also has a chat now feature that you can actually start a text chat if you're not able to speak on the phone. But for those who are able to pick up the phone and call, the number is 1-800-799-SAFE. And here in California, for additional resources, we have the California Partnership to End Domestic Violence. And their number is 1-916-444-7163. And one of the things that I really want to let people know right now is that even though folks may have heard that, the courts are not fully functioning to their normal level because of coronavirus, people can still file and obtain a restraining order. That is still happening. So uh, there are resources available, and I really want to encourage people, you know, obviously it's really hard, but to reach out. And if there's one thing I want to add, I mean, just to your point about verbal and emotional abuse, I was actually shocked when I saw the research that showed that verbal and emotional abuse is not only equally as damaging biologically as physical abuse, but in many times, oftentimes, we endure it longer, right? Because physical abuse leaves bruises and scars that you can see. And I think there's enough um, common wisdom in our culture that people recognize that and say, that's abuse. And it may be really hard to get away from, but at least it's like flagged in your mind. And with verbal abuse, oftentimes it can take a very long time for someone to understand, oh my goodness, that controlling behavior, that person who is demeaning, demeaning and name calling and and yelling, all of these different things, that is actually abuse, and that is equally harmful. And the piece that has been amazingly heartening for me in my career as a pediatrician is that in doing this work about adverse childhood experiences, about trauma, in screening and opening up some of these conversations, what I've seen over and over and over again, so many people who were willing to get help for their kids where they hadn't been able to get help for themselves, right? And that for me is what's so heartening, is to see how many people are willing to do that.
And I think that that is though what happens. I think for so many people, it affects them, and they think, well, I can take it because
That's right.
I should do this. I should stay. This is best for my children because they're not being harmed or not physically harmed, and they're not understanding the effects that maybe they are experiencing, of course. And then I would caution that you wait, and it does one day affect the children in a way that's more obvious, and and that woman might wish she'd left a lot sooner.
And what I would say also for those situations is that I think many people don't understand that what children witness can harm them. People think that if you don't lay hands on the kids, right? Oh, I may be screaming at your mom, I may be laying hands on your mom, but I didn't touch the kid, so it's not child maltreatment. For a child to witness their parent being harmed is damaging to them biologically, right? And fortunately, we now are able to recognize that, and we're able to implement some of the healing treatments, which is what we're doing across the state of California with trauma-informed care. I encourage every doctor, you don't have to be from California, to go to acesaware.org and take our training on trauma-informed care to know how to recognize the signs, how to counsel your patients, and what are some effective interventions. Um, and
Would you be
and
willing
yeah,
will you be encouraging judges and others within the system in California to be taking this training?
that's the hope. So we had intended, our goal had been to do cross-sector training. And even just in December, I did the keynote address at the Judicial Council for California with it was 2,000 judges in a room, family court judges, talking about adverse childhood experiences, trauma, the impacts on health, and what judges can do to be more trauma informed. So that was the hope. You know, one of the big challenges around coronavirus is that so much of our public health resources are focused in mitigating the virus. My hope that with the support of the governor, we can continue to do cross-sector training, because my goal is that not only every judge, but every police officer, every educator, every child care worker, every social worker, everyone understands the impact of trauma and health, and that we are creating a trauma-informed public health approach to this, because it is a public health crisis, right? When a new virus comes in, we recognize it as a public health crisis, but violence and trauma is a public health crisis that has gone almost, I don't want to say unnoticed, but certainly not adequately addressed. And the coronavirus is only exacerbating that problem. So we really need to double down on those protections right now.
Well, I'm with you. We're with you. I couldn't agree more. And it is for families. I know at this time they're worried about so much, and there is so much stress. So I'm so happy your voice is out there and this is being understood. And I do hope that people at home, really hear it and take away to take care of each other and to reach out for help and to be aware of the effects, especially on the children during this time.